Okay, well, I'll first start off and say this is not going to be much of an escape to the forest. In fact, we're going to be running away from the forest to basically the shores of wetlands. And this group of birds that I'm going to talk about, shorebirds, it's what they're in the order Charadriiformes, and almost uniformly as a group, I don't think we could have picked a group of birds that are more sort of avoiding of forests for the most part. There's a few exceptions and that sort of thing, but I think, you know, if you're interested in forested landscapes, if you're a manager of a forested property, or, you know, have personal property of your own, I think this is still useful because on that property, you may have certain wetlands and that sort of thing that can be managed for shorebirds. And so I guess my goal here is overall just to call your attention to this group of birds and give you some understanding and appreciation of their diversity, ecology, and management. We'll be focusing pretty much on shorebirds in Ohio. Just a little bit more about me. I wouldn't call myself a shorebird expert, as in I have spent my entire career studying shorebirds. Basically, I do research on population and habitat relationships of upland game birds and waterfowl. That's been principally my research focus. But since I work with waterfowl in wetlands, I've gotten to work with other species of wetland birds, including rails and cranes and things like that. And then shorebirds. I've always been fascinated with shorebirds, you know, as I've encountered them doing waterfowl studies and that sort of thing. I think they're just a terribly interesting group, and it would have been nice, and it could be nice to have spent a career on that. But so I just kind of want to say that you know, I'm not somebody who's studied them exclusively, so, you know, there is a limitation to the depth of my knowledge. But what I do want to do is share with you what I have learned in working with these birds. And so I'm going to start off with just introducing this group of birds to you. And I'll credit Marnie. She had as an initial title for this presentation, From Plovers to Pipers. And I was really gratified that Marnie actually remembered that there's plovers and there's pipers, because she took the class that I taught some years ago where we covered shorebird identification, classification, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to first do is take you on just a diversity tour of Ohio shorebirds. And one thing I'll say is that most of these species are migrants through Ohio. In fact, there are only 7 species in the current Ohio Breeding Bird Atlas that are listed as currently breeding. So mostly we're dealing with migrating birds that come through during fall and spring migration. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. And I'll point out those breeding shorebirds that do occasionally or more frequently breed in Ohio as we go through this. So on the left here, we have a semi-palmated plover, and on the right, we have a semi-palmated sandpiper, so plovers to pipers. And I guess if there's anything that's going to kind of be apparent to you is that, you know, these birds are kind of hard to identify and separate. The plovers are in a completely different family than the sandpipers, and to me they look vastly different, and I can recognize the difference, but I think on first blush you might find it a bit challenging to even separate those. Well, it gets more difficult than that as we go, as you'll see. So this isn't meant to be a tutorial in shorebird identification. Mostly I'll just kind of point out a few things, share with you a few quips and anecdotes and that sort of thing, but more or less just kind of sit back a little bit and just kind of appreciate the diversity of form and appearance of these different birds as we go through. So we're going to start with the plovers, which are in the family Charadriidae. And as long as I'm throwing out taxonomic names, shorebirds are in the order of Charadriiformes, which also includes gulls and terns. So just to give you some context, that shorebirds are related, at least at the order level, to gulls and terns that are probably a bit more familiar to you. So we're going to take this in kind of in the order that these birds appear in the bird book in sort of phylogenetic order. And I'll just kind of share with you two very large plovers here on the left. We have a male on the top, American golden plover, and a female American golden plover. And then on the right, we have the black-bellied plover with the male on the top and the female on the bottom. Now, what I'm going to be showing you here are mostly pictures of these birds in their breeding plumages. And that's when they're most distinct and most easily recognizable. I'll talk about what happens later in the year because it gets worse as we go along, especially during the fall migration and maybe the early spring migration. These birds aren't yet in their full breeding plumages, but that's what I'm showing you here mostly in these photographs, just so you get a sense of their aesthetic beauty and that sort of thing, and the diversity of coloration and that sort of thing. So these are the large plovers. A lot of these birds, I'll just kind of say, are often Arctic or boreal breeders, or maybe the northern kind of Great Plains prairie areas. And they come through Ohio, and they often winter in places like South America and that sort of thing. Some are even some circumpolar migrants. So they migrate long distances. The American golden plover, for instance, nests in the Arctic and winters in southern South America. Okay, then we have on the left here, most of you should be able to recognize this one. This is the killdeer. And that's probably the shorebird that is most familiar to most people. And so, you know, we see these in kind of open areas, oftentimes, you know, very human impacted areas like lawns and you know, gravel areas, kind of disturbed areas, that sort of thing. They like that kind of open type of habitat. They make their nests, just scoop out a little bowl and lay the eggs in there without much else and that sort of thing. And they're very, very hard to find, very cryptic. Anyway, on the right-hand side, we have a semi-palmated plover, which, and I should mention too, that these photos are not to scale. So don't infer anything about, you know, relative body size, but I'll say that the common, or the killdeer is probably a bit smaller than the American golden, or it is a bit smaller than the American golden and black-bellied. The semi-palmated plover is really almost kind of tiny. It's like some of the smaller other shorebirds in the family Scolopacidae that we'll encounter here. So you probably mistake the semi-palmated plover for one of those other shorebirds, but what you look for with these birds are, if you notice, they have really big eyes and then kind of a short pecking bill, and that reflects their foraging mode. We'll talk about this more along the lines, or along the line as we go through this. They have the large eyes because they feed on often very tiny flying insects like midges and that sort of thing. And then they have that pecking bill because they're usually pecking things off the surface, that sort of thing. So the semi-palmated plover, though, here is actually pulling out a worm. It probably has a little bit of a different diet than the killdeer, but it's still kind of focused on those emerging insects. But, you know, there's some variation and overlap. As long as I'm talking about food habits and that sort of thing, one thing I would say that characterizes this group is there's some exceptions, but mostly they feed on aquatic invertebrates, either in the larval or the adult flying life stage. There's a few species, and some have kind of varied diets, but the general theme is adult or larval aquatic insects or crustaceans that they feed on. There are some that will feed on some fish and that sort of thing, and crustaceans and things like that. And some are somewhat vegetarian too. They'll feed on some seeds and berries and that sort of thing. But mostly you can think of they're really dependent on invertebrate prey. Here's a couple of uncommon plovers, let's see. Now I gotta remember here. On the left, we've got the snowy plover, and I've only seen this once in Ohio, up on the Great Lakes Marsh region, And then on the right, we have the piping plover, which is really kind of an endangered species in the Great Lakes region. They nest along beaches and that sort of thing, and they're really subject to human disturbance, and their populations are especially imperiled in the Great Lakes region. And so there's a lot of conservation effort on the piping plover, which is the bird on the right. But you can see some of the things that these birds share in common with the at least the killdeer and the semi-palmated plover, is those black bands, the black forehead. You know, the piping plover has that bicolored bill like the semi-palmated. So just kind of one thing as we go through this, the way to kind of identify shorebirds is kind of first by shape. So you can see these plovers are kind of squat, they have short necks, kind of a big forehead, and those short pecking bills. You know, after that, you're looking at things like tail length and neck length and just overall body conformation. And then you have to look closely sometimes at bill color and foot color to separate them. So I'll just kind of give you a few of those pointers as we go along. So these next two birds are in the family Recurverostridae. And Recurverostridae means curved bill, upcurved bill. That's somewhat evident in the black-necked stilt on the right, but it's very, very apparent in the American Avocet on the left. Now, the American Avocet is something that will occasionally be seen here. It's probably seen here in Ohio every single year, but it's not one that I would characterize as a typical bird that you would expect to see. Although I come from South Dakota, the Great Plains and that sort of thing, and they're really more abundant further west from here. And I think these are just two of the most elegant shorebirds there are. They're some of the bigger ones, and then of course the black-necked stilt has probably the longest legs. But anyway, the black-necked stilt is a breeder in Ohio in a very few places. Most recently, there's been a population breeding on Howard Marsh near Oregon, Ohio, up on Lake Erie. And that's a recent restoration, and they've been breeding there for, I think, 3-4 years now already. A few pairs, just, you know, 3, 4, 5, something like that. We'll see if they persist there, but it is a bird that will breed here in Ohio. Okay. And then we move on to really a common summer bird. They don't breed here in Ohio. You might think that they do, but they mostly breed up kind of further north and west in the Great Plains and in the subboreal area and that sort of thing. But they are here in force throughout a lot of the summer and into the fall. And so we have the very descriptive name for these birds, the greater and lesser yellowlegs. You can see the yellow legs. So, you know, in August, July, August, September, you go to a marsh with some mudflat and that sort of thing, you should see a number of these different birds here. They're difficult to separate. They have similar calls. You can tell them by their calls. One has a 3-note and one has a 2-note call, and I don't recall which is which here. But the other way that I typically tell them visually is by the length of the bill. The greater yellowlegs basically has a bill that is longer than 2 times the length of the head, whereas the lesser yellowlegs, it's a bit shorter, 1.5. Sounds like I'm splitting hairs there, but it is a useful technique. The other thing is the greater yellowlegs has a little bit more flecking under here. That's another good characteristic tell. It's the lesser has a little bit of that, but they're just more white underneath, that sort of thing. If you see them side by side, you'd probably recognize them on the basis of size. There's not a vast difference, but it's something recognizable. But if you see them separately, it's really kind of hard to judge just based on overall body size, which is which. And then we have the solitary and spotted sandpipers. On the left is the solitary, and you can identify those because they're alone, right? Yeah, right. I'm sure everybody's laughing. But typically, you do see them by themselves. Obviously, they do get together to mate and raise young and that sort of thing. But this is the one bird that's an exception, that most of the shorebirds are ground nesters. Almost all of them are ground nesters. This one actually nests up in trees. They don't nest here in Ohio, but they do nest in old nests of other birds that nest in trees. So there's one exception and one link to actually kind of the forest, if you will. On the right, we have the spotted sandpiper, aptly named. This is a bird that does breed in Ohio, and it's pretty common. You know, when you first encounter them and see them fly, these two birds look very similar. Now, those spots aren't always present on this bird. It depends on the time of the year. But another good way to tell them, obviously, there's a difference in the bill color. They're about the same size. The solitary sandpiper has those distinct spots on the mantle, that is the wings there on the upper part of the body, whereas the spotted sandpiper is more kind of a lighter color brown with some spots and that sort of thing. And the other thing about spotted sandpipers is they kind of wag their tail end as they move along, and that's also a good characteristic that a lot of people use. So both these birds, like during the summer, especially, I'm a fisherman, and if I fish along the shoreline, I usually see a little shorebird that sort of bounces ahead of me as I'm, working the shoreline fishing for bass or crappie or something. It's either a solitary or a spotted sandpiper there. So maybe you've encountered that, and they usually do tend to be pretty much by themselves, both of these species. And then we have the Willet and Upland Sandpiper. The Willet is a migrant through here. Again, it's kind of like the Avocet. I think you see them more as you go west toward the Great Plains. I remember those in South Dakota. They have a very distinct call that goes, "Whoa, Willet, whoa, Willet." And they're a pretty large bird, and they have this very distinct white stripes. Now, they do migrate here through Ohio somewhat. Not in any great abundance, at least in my experience, but it is a large shorebird with a straight bill that, does come through here. And then on the right, we have an upland sandpiper. And this bird is a bird that breeds in Ohio, but it's very spotty. We don't have the grasslands that we used to, and so they're not quite abundant, but they do breed in local areas in Ohio. So this is really not a bird that you associate with wetlands, maybe moist areas of open grassland and that sort of thing, and sometimes in association with some agriculture. So that's the bird on the right. And then we have the Whimbrel. Just another interesting bird. I don't know a lot about these. These come through, but they have this decurved bill, and just a very interesting, very, very large shorebird, easily recognized. They kind of have the same appearance as a Dowitcher, at least on the body, but the Dowitcher has a shorter, straighter bill. So if you see that down curved bill, you might be tempted to say, "Oh, I've seen a curlew or something," but curlews don't really come through here that much, but it's more likely to be a Whimbrel. And then we have the Hudsonian and marbled Godwits. I think the more common one is the Hudsonian that comes through here. You might see, I don't have a picture here of a bar-tailed Godwit, but this is another very large shorebird, and they have this bicolored bill that's slightly upturned. So you might see one of those 2 or 3 species coming through here. The Hudsonian Godwit is a very, very long distance migrant, by the way. It spans 2 hemispheres, kind of pretty much like the American golden plover. And then we have a couple of other birds, the Ruddy Turnstone, which I think that's my favorite name for a shorebird. There's another bird called the wandering tattler that I've always kind of liked the name. I've never seen one. They don't occur in our area, so I didn't include it. But, name-wise, wandering tattler and the Ruddy Turnstone just something that does it for me. The Ruddy Turnstone here in the breeding plumage is very distinct with that black breast and and the alternating sort of bands of black and reddish brown color there, and the distinct face markings. And then what's really interesting is their triangular shaped bill. And I'll talk more about that coming up. The Sanderling is the bird on the right. And from this point forward, this is where it really gets tough in terms of identifying shorebirds, starting with the Sanderling. This again is one in breeding plumage. Now, Sanderling is probably, you know, most your average person, if they think of shorebirds, this may be what they're thinking of, because if you've been along a beach and you see the shorebirds that are skittering back and forth with the waves, you know, as they come in on a beach, those are generally typically Sanderlings that do that. They like to run back and forth and forage on the invertebrates that are exposed with the washing of the waves up against the shore, that sort of thing. So that really, the Sanderling, with that we start pretty much another family called the Scolopacidae, and that would include all the rest of the shorebirds. So most of the species are packed in this family Scolopacidae. And what people typically refer to these are, they call them the peeps. Okay, so, you know, when I did an earlier presentation, I did a search on peeps to find images. And of course, I didn't see shorebirds. I saw these nice marshmallow candies that I enjoy around Easter and that sort of thing. But anyway, these peeps as a group are quite challenging. I would say the peeps are kind of like the warblers of the wetland bird world for birders, because they present the same sorts of challenges in terms of identification, because there's such diversity and subtle differences in appearance. And I think they're even more challenging than identifying warblers, to tell you the truth. So they are hard to identify. A lot of them look very, very similar, especially during the non-breeding season. And they often occur together in large flocks, just like the peeps that you see here. So to start off with, let's see, we've got the Dublin, the Dublin, I misspelled that. I think that was the danger of word correct and word perfect. I know darn well, these are Dunlins, not Dublins, okay? They're not Irish, right? But anyway, my favorite shorebird, I think, is the Dunlin, for whatever reason. So I've got a nice carving here of a Dunlin. It was given to me by one of my graduate students that studied shorebirds, and he asked me what my favorite shorebird was, and I had to think about it a little bit. And I said, well, I think it's the Dunlin. And now that I go back and think about it, when I was in Alaska, I got this Dunlin carved in ancient whalebone by Inuit. So yeah, I think at that point I pretty much decided the Dunlins are my favorites. I don't know why. I've just seen them in a variety of different places. I like that black patch on their belly for some reason. I don't know. I just think they're cool. On the right is the Pectoral Sandpiper. And it's not, again, this is not to scale, but this is one of the larger members of the Scolopacidae, or one of the larger peeps. During the breeding season, they have this really distinct bib of those sort of striping, black, brown, and white striping there that you can see. And then, you know, after that, you're really kind of looking at relative sizes and body shape and that sort of thing to identify these birds. The shape of the bill, is it straight? Is it down curved a little bit? So like the Dunlin, you can see that you've got a bit of a down curved bill there. The Pectoral Sandpiper is more or less straight. The legs on the Dunlin and the bill are both black, whereas the legs are kind of a dusky yellowish color. So you're going to be, you kind of have to learn these shorebirds by their overall body shape and form, a little bit on size, but also the shape of the bill and the coloring of the feet and the bill. And oftentimes this superciliary line that goes through the eye. And that's actually a common sort of characteristic a lot of different bird groups, is, you know, that striping around the eye and that sort of thing. Here now we're getting to the really difficult to identify sandpipers. The previous two, the Dunlin and the the Pectoral Sandpiper, I think, are fairly easy to recognize with a little bit of practice, but it gets really tough from here. On the left, we have the White-rumped Sandpiper. Here again, you might think this could look like a Dublin in a non-breeding plumage, but it doesn't quite have the length and total downturn to the bill. But the feet are dark, as well as the bill is dark. But one of the other characteristics is you look at the wing and it goes beyond the tail. There's another characteristic used to separate some of these different birds. On the right here, you've got, oops, I didn't mean to do that. You've got the Baird Sandpiper. Golly, you know, how do you explain the differences in some of these without going into great detail? But again, you're starting to, you have to kind of think of these combinations of bill shape and bill color and foot color and that sort of thing, and body conformation. And, you know, sometimes it comes down to knowledge of what's coming through at a particular time of year to kind of narrow your choices. And then you just kind of work at it from there. Basically, I think to be good at identifying shorebirds, you're going to have a pretty good pair of binoculars, if not a pair of spotting scopes, if you really want to get into it. Because, you know, you're not going to get very close to most of these birds. They fly pretty readily and that sort of thing. So you really need some optical equipment to help you with identification. So the next two, semi-palmated and least sandpipers, these are very, very common migrants through Ohio. On the left, the semi-palmated means their feet are somewhat a little bit webbed, kind of where the toes join. That's where that name comes from. How do you identify these? Well, they're nice and white underneath, more or less a straight, relatively short bill. And the other cue that I'll give you is, like, if you see a bunch of birds in a flock and somebody says, identify that bunch of birds out there for me, and you have no absolute clue, say semi-palmated sandpiper, because that is the most abundant sandpiper in North America. So the odds are with you if you say semi-palmated sandpiper. Similarly, the least sandpiper, if it's really tiny and it looks like a sandpiper, yeah, you might go with that. But again, here now we see a bird that has a dark bill but more yellowish legs and that sort of thing. And again, you go on body size and conformation. You can see the bill is a little bit longer than in the semi-palmated, and it's a little bit sort of narrower, more finer. So, and then we'll go on to the Stilt and Buff-breasted sandpipers. These should be fairly easy to recognize. The Stilt sandpiper is a bird in breeding plumage. Most of the time they don't appear like this when we see them here in Ohio, but they do have relatively long legs, a pretty long bill, and a little bit more of an upright posture. And they're sort of a medium size to larger, smaller than a Yellowlegs, but bigger than these other peeps that we see. And then the buff-breasted sandpiper is just that kind of uniform, sort of nice, tawny tan to light brown color all through the breast and around the head and that sort of thing. And then the other thing I want to call your attention to is the big eye and kind of more of a pecking bill. And so you might think, oh, that looks kind of like a plover. Well, that's because they inhabit the same type of wetland zone and consume the same similar type of prey here. So here's an example of convergent evolution between the plover family and the Scolopacidae, because they're kind of adapting to feeding in the kind of same area, that sort of thing. So these guys have a little bit of a larger eye and more of a pecking bill, similar to the plovers, but other than that, a very distinct plumage coloration, and they do look like one of these sandpipers. So that's the end of the peeps. So when you search on peeps, you get all kinds of weird stuff here. So that's the end of the peeps, but we're not done with the shorebirds yet. We got a few more to go through. And so I'm going to go on with that. And we've got the long and the short-billed Dowitcher here. these are very, very difficult to separate between the long and the short-billed. There's some very subtle differences in their plumage. I would say that the long-billed has kind of more of a darker mantle. That's this area along the back here. Here it's kind of more varied and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of sort of intergrading and that sort of thing. They're very difficult to separate. I think too, these white spots at the base of the bill help separate them if you can see them. But a lot of times it's kind of like knowing where you are and what's coming through at the particular time to separate these two out. But as a group, the Dowitchers, I think, are pretty easy to identify. They have these kind of roundish, very football-shaped bodies with long, straight bills. And when you see them feeding out in a wetland, they look like a sewing machine needle, just kind of probing constantly like this. So that's the long and the short-billed Dowitcher. Let's see, anyway. Then we've got a couple of other species with also long bills, but they're much smaller than the Dowitchers, and they have a very distinct appearance. So on the left is the American woodcock. Some people call them timberdoodles. And so this is the one species that is associated with forested habitat. And they like early successional, very dense cover, probably next to some herbaceous cover with a few openings, which is where they display. They have a very distinct display, as does the snipe on the left. But anyway, these do breed in Ohio, the woodcock, and they also migrate through here in the fall and the winter. And these two species also are the only species of shorebirds that are legally hunted in most states, including Ohio. So they are a game bird. The American woodcock is sort of a very traditional game bird. And hunting woodcock goes back to European roots and that sort of thing. There's a woodcock in Europe that they hunt. But anyway, these are birds of, at least the woodcock is a bird of conservation concern because of the maturation of our forests, and we're losing that early successional moist type habitat. These guys feed most exclusively on earthworms. They take a few other insects by basically probing into the soil. And we get some really good migrations of woodcock coming through here in October, and then they start coming back toward the end of the hunting season, I think in January or February as well. Then the snipe is also a game bird. People hunt these along the margins of marshes. Early in the season, sometimes waterfowl hunters will take these if they see them, but you got to be good at identification if you're a hunter, because you can easily, kill some other shorebird that is illegal. So you kind of need to know what you're doing if you're hunting these species. The Wilson snipe we're just on the very edge of their breeding range. I wouldn't really call it it would be a uncommon breeder here in Ohio, but we're just south of their breeding range. But there are some records of breeding by the Wilson snipe. The way you tell these two different birds apart is based on habitat, but you might find some areas where they overlap. But the difference is that the American woodcock has this, more consistent reddish brown plumage. There are these bars that go crosswise on their head, whereas the bars go lengthwise on the head of the snipe. And you can just see the snipe is just much more mottled and that sort of thing. Both of these birds have really interesting breeding displays that involve flight and that sort of thing. So they're interesting in that manner too. The snipe do something called winnowing, where they fly up and then they rapidly fly down, and their tail feathers they move and they create kind of a winnowing sound, kind of a somewhat high-pitched sound. And then we have the Wilsons and redneck Phalaropes. There's also a northern Phalarope that might come through here. I just kind of picked the redneck. The Wilsons is the one that you're most likely to see, but occasionally rednecked or black Phalarope, or northern Phalarope, I'm sorry. So here I'm showing birds in breeding plumages, And these are females. And they're interesting in the sense that they have sexual role reversal. The males are the more dull colored birds, even in their breeding plumage, because they incubate the nest and the female does not. Most of these other shorebirds, for the most part, both the male and female participate in incubation. And some of those, it's just the female, but mostly it's male-female trading off incubation, but it's completely reversed in the Phalaropes. And these birds are interesting because you're generally going to see, you can see them standing in the mud flats and that sort of thing, but often they feed out in deeper water by swimming, and they kind of spin around as they're feeding. And that's a good way to kind of tell them. They have this long, slender bill, and what they're doing is they're gleaning insects that are at or near the water surface for the most part. Also a very sort of elegant shorebird as well. So anyway, I kind of warned you as far as identification goes. A good resource is the Cornell All About Birds website, and they've got some nice pictures of all these different birds in both their breeding plumages and their juvenile plumages and their summer plumages and so on and so forth. And they have a lot of good life history information and ID pointers and that sort of thing. So here we have that American golden plover. If you remember that very first bird I had in the first slide, it was just, you know, very, very stunning in terms of its coloration. Well, now here are the juveniles, and then a non-breeding adult bird on the right. So they lose that plumage during the non-breeding season. So they have two molts during the year, one that produces the breeding plumage, and that usually occurs during migration. And so when we see them in spring migration, they're just coming into that plumage. It may not be fully developed. It might be a mix between the breeding and the non-breeding, depending on the species. And then over the summer, as they come back, that plumage has started to wear, so they appear somewhat in between, but they're still in their breeding plumage, but their appearance changed just because the feathers are worn. And then they get into their winter plumage or their non-breeding plumage, where they all become more nondescript, very much like ducks. So here's an example. That Dunlin that's my favorite is the breeding adult on the left becomes this very nondescript breeding adult on the right, or the center and the right here. So now during the summer, and especially during the fall or during the wintering season, if you're in some place where they're wintering, you're going to be relying mostly on those bill characteristics, body shape and size, so on and so forth. So this is a good resource if you want to start learning these birds and their different plumages. So anyway, this just kind of summarizes. This is a page out of the Eastern Birds Breeding or Bird Identification Guide. And you really just have to learn all these different markers, you know, in order to separate these species. Because I know if you sit here and look at this page on the right, you say, boy, those all look very similar. How do I separate them out? You have to look at those very, very specific characteristics and have a good field guide. And then, like I said, they have these two different molts where they appear completely different. And then even when they're still in their breeding plumage, but they're starting to migrate during the summer, they actually start migration during the summer, as we'll see. That plumage is more worn, and just because of that wear, their plumage changes. So it's a real challenge to identify these birds, especially those peeps that I talked about. Okay, I'm going to check my time here. I need to sort of move on. I'm going to try to tell you just a little bit more about these species. I'm going to kind of take you on another tour of the shorebirds, and we'll do this fairly quickly here, because what we do is we separate shorebirds into different guilds that are based on their body size, the leg length, the bill shape and size, and their foraging behavior, and that represents also the wetland zone that they occupy, okay? So we kind of separate these very fine taxonomic differentiations by species into these larger groups that are sort of ecologically based, if you will. And that kind of helps us in terms of management and understanding their life history. So we have these guilds that are defined by that habitat association, but that habitat association is also defined by how they forage. So we have small gleaners that inhabit beaches and dry mudflats, small probers that inhabit moist mudflats, large probers that inhabit moist mudflats and shallow water, and then we have these larger gleaners that predominantly inhabit shallow water. Okay, so you can kind of see some examples here. This is why these bill lengths vary so much, because the type of prey that they're going after is buried down here somewhere in the mud or at the surface, and they have bill lengths that are best adapted to secure the food that they have evolved to exploit. Okay, so let me talk about these different shorebird habitats for a moment. This is a photograph of one of the Winus Point marshes here, and what it shows you is, we'll start here in the background. We have kind of the meadow and the marsh area. Shorebirds start to inhabit that. You'll see the plovers up in here to some degree. You'll all see them down here in the dry mud flats. So what we have here is a progression, like these areas here in this photo. It's kind of a summer, early summer, late spring photo. You can see the vegetation is developing here. And so this area was, when the water came down, it was exposed, it became mud, and then vegetation starts to grow. And then we get the dry mud flat down here, which you can kind of see through here. You can see some of the plants starting to germinate. So that's another type of habitat. And then we have the wet mud flat. And then we have shallow water just after that. And then deep water. And I say because it's not very deep. Shorebirds forage up to about 24 centimeters water depth, but it's a deeper zone than this shallow water. So the point is that each of these different taxonomic groups that I've kind of taken you through have different ranges of water depths in which they forage. And that kind of corresponds to some of these guilds, if you will. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but you can see, you know, the small sandpipers are right here, very restrictive gradient from wet to almost no water. You've got your plovers and curlews that start off in the dry mud flats, so on and so forth. Those avocets and stilts with the long legs, as you might imagine, are out in the deeper water. Yellowlegs to some degree as well. Godwits somewhere in the middle, and then the Phalaropes. They don't wade out into that water, but they swim, so they can get out into some fairly deep water, up to 20 centimeters, and that's deep for a shorebird. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at these birds again and how we might categorize them according to the habitat that they're occupying. Now, these are generalizations. It's not like they only don't go beyond the boundaries of these different habitat types. There is obviously some overlap and bleeding, but this is a generality. So the killdeer, the Baird sandpiper, buff-breasted sandpiper, black-bellied plover, golden plover, they inhabit this dry mudflat habitat for the most part. And again, they're feeding mostly on those emergent insects in those mudflats. And then we get the moist mudflats, and there's a vast diversity of different species that inhabit the moist mudflats. So we have red knot here. Let's see, we have the semi-palmated sandpiper and the semi-palmated plover are kind of out more in the moist mudflat. And they do a bit of probing, but they also kind of glean along the surface in these moist mudflats to get both larval and early emerging insects and that sort of thing. So we got a whole lot of species diversity packed right in here in this moist mudflat. That's probably where you're going to find the largest number of species. Let's see here. Looks like I repeated that slide with a different set of birds here. So your snipe is included in there, the Dublin, and let's see, probably what I've got is a pectoral sandpiper and one of the other sandpipers there. And then we get out into that shallow water, and now is where we get these longer-legged shorebirds with longer bills, and they're either gleaning or probing for insects, or sometimes even some vertebrate prey like small fish or amphibians and that sort of thing. or maybe sort of probing yet into the mud at the bottom of the shallow water to get benthic invertebrates as well. And then we have the ones that inhabit the deeper water. That would be the American Avocet, the Hudsonian Godwit, the Phalaropes, which I don't show here, and of course the black-necked stilt. So you can kind of see how their body shapes and forms kind of are adapted to the particular habitats that they occupy. And so this is kind of important for management, because management of wetlands, as we'll see, is all about water levels and water depths. And you try to create wetland conditions that attract these different guilds of birds. And if you want the greatest diversity, you want kind of a slow drawdown in your wetlands so that you have all of these different zones represented. We'll probably talk more about that a little bit. And then we got, of course, the upland birds, the American woodcock and the upland sandpiper that I've already talked about. Here is I just thought I'd throw this in. Here's a chick American woodcock here. This is a woodcock flying here, and this kind of represents what their habitat looks like. So they are considered to be a forest bird. And then we have the beech, and I was being kind of silly here when I said B-E-C-H, because I thought I probably had an audience of a lot of forestry-oriented people, but it's really beech, B-E-A-C-H, just a stupid little joke on my part. And that's where you have your Sanderlings, snowy plover, and the ruddy turnstone. The ruddy turnstone, remember that triangular bill? That's adapted for turning over these shells and looking for invertebrates that are hiding under there. Just kind of an interesting aside. Okay, well, I'm going to shift gears here and just talk a little bit more just about, relative abundance of these species and that sort of thing. So we know from a lot of different sources, and especially a recent paper in Science, that wetland birds are overall on the decline. Overall waterfowl as a wetland bird are doing quite well, but shorebirds are on the decline. And why is that? Well, I don't think we have all of the answers yet, but there's a number of things involved with these. Are migratory birds that are dependent on finding food in the right places at the right time. So climate change is coming into play here, but also impacts because they spend so much time in migration, and in the winter, they breed in mostly fairly secure areas where the habitat is still pretty good, but they're probably limited by conditions during migration and possibly even during winter. But we kind of think it's mostly habitat conditions during the spring. So like I said, these birds are overall as a group circumpolar migrants almost. They migrate over a variety of different pathways. The pathways generally kind of break down as Atlantic coast, Pacific coast in the Western Hemisphere, and then sort of interior migrants, as you can see. So we got these three general pathways. The pathways differ between fall and spring. There are some birds, shorebirds, that come through Ohio pretty much during the fall, but not during the spring, and vice versa. So they have what we call kind of a circular migration. And so that adds a little bit of complexity to our conservation planning. I'll have to credit the Black Swamp Bird Observatory for this data. They've been monitoring shorebird migrations along the Lake Erie region. And this kind of is the total picture of shorebird migration peaks throughout the year. So we have a very pronounced short peak in the spring that starts about the beginning of May, kind of peaks toward the middle of May, and then sharply drops off after June. So the spring migration is fairly quick. A lot of birds coming through in a very short period of time. Their duration of stay is not quite as long. And then all of a sudden, we have a peak during the summer, and that's actually the start of fall migration. The start of fall migration is right around toward the end of June or the beginning of July. And so we have another peak coming through, and then another very sharp peak coming through right about, now we're on that ascending limb here as we enter October. So we're getting into another peak of shorebird migration, at least in the Lake Erie region. Well, this is a composite for a large number of species, and they all have different kind of migration strategies. And actually the timing of migration of different age sex classes varies. And that's what creates that summer peak is sometimes you'll have one sex age cohort coming through in the fall migration during the summer, and then another one will follow, and that sort of thing. So it really sort of complicates things, but pretty much if we go back to this slide or we look at this one, that fall migration is very prolonged with a variety of different species on different schedules coming through over a wider range of time. So the fall migration as a group is quite prolonged, and there are some species that have very prolonged fall migration. So you can think of fall migration as more leisurely. The birds are just kind of following the weather patterns and food availability, whereas in spring, they're in a big rush to get to the breeding grounds, more or less. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about now is a little bit more about ecology and management of shorebirds during migration in Ohio. And I'm going to try to end this here pretty quick, but I got a few more things to go through. The star is misplaced here as I altered this graph. It's meant to highlight this area right here, the Western Lake Erie Basin, basically. So we have the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. You know, one way to manage for shorebirds is to make sure that they have stopover points both on the coast and in the interior of the continent, where we can focus on providing the right habitats and foods and that sort of thing to sustain them during those migrations, which I said are, you know, really quite important, of course, to migratory birds, but particularly to shorebirds. A lot of the attention has been focused on these coastal areas and less attention, but more as we go along now on these interior coastal areas. And the Lake Erie region is actually one of that's been given regional status by WISRN. So I'm going to focus on some stuff we've been doing looking at shorebird ecology and management in the Upper Miss and Great Lakes region. Pretty large area with a very diverse landscape, as you can see, very much human impacted, water levels affected by lake levels in the Great Lakes and precipitation levels locally and that sort of thing. But anyway, as you can see, that Great Lakes region is an important migratory pathway. We see the cross migration patterns of, this is for waterfowl, but other water birds follow this too. We see a real concentration here in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So our area is really quite important. And if we look at wetland losses in that sort of mid-latitude area, this is where we've lost a lot of our wetland habitat. So you can kind of think of is during that migration northward, we've lost a lot of habitat that sustains these birds in migration. So that's one of the things that, you know, I've had several studies working on. So the Lake Erie Marsh region is a remnant of the Great Black Swamp. The remnant wetlands, the coastal wetlands are mostly diked to protect vegetation from high lake levels, but they're drawn down during the fall and the spring, usually to provide food resources or hunting opportunity for waterfowl hunters. And the shorebirds can exploit them if it's done at the right time. Okay, and then of course, then we have the seiches events in the estuaries of the Lake Erie Marsh region that provide additional habitat and that sort of thing. So that's just kind of a quick description of what's going on, as these managed marshes are really important to sustaining these species. They really occur on a very sharp gradient between the lake and adjacent cropland. These wetlands, these managed marshes are pinched, if you will, between rising lake levels and the pressure of development, either agriculture or urban development. And so they have to be intensively managed in order to maintain the vegetation and the water levels. This is not how it worked before development, but this is really what we're left with here. So we have managed marshes and moist soil and hemi-marshes that have just basically different amounts of vegetation and different causes of these water level fluctuations and that sort of thing. So we did some work to look at how shorebird distribution differs among these different marsh types that have different various vegetation characteristics as well as hydrological patterns. So Tara Baranowski, for her MS thesis, did a random sample of quadrats across the Lake Erie Marsh region, mostly around Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge and Winus Point on Muddy Creek Bay, if you're familiar with that. And, you know, kind of her question was, you know, these marshes are managed for waterfowl, and they're managed with different types of habitats like moist soil, hemi-marsh, deep marsh, open water. Well, the question was, where do shorebirds fit into that whole picture? And one thing that we did was basically did some counts over during the fall and spring migration in different years, and basically found out that those managed marshes are a huge component of shorebird supporting shorebird use days. Cropland, very insignificant, and then this beach estuary out near the lake also becoming very important. The other thing I'll mention is that if we take these numbers in terms of shorebird use, we think we can get to the international status for the WISR network and get that kind of a designation for the Lake Erie Marsh region. But anyway, if we look at the autumn period and focus on shorebirds, they're really dependent on the lake level type habitats at Ottawa, because they have a big estuary there, the Crane Creek estuary. If we go over to Winus Point, the shorebirds made more use of that managed marsh because that was what was available, but they also used almost equally this estuary habitat. So these are the two key habitats that we have to manage shorebirds for. The cropland, a lot of people talk about how shorebirds use cropland so much. Well, I think that's overdone. I think it's because they're just more easily seen here, but the key is these estuaries and the managed marshes in terms of sustaining shorebirds. And particularly during the spring, the managed marshes are really important for shorebirds. And I think this has to do with the lake level fluctuations and what's going on in those marshes. They're very productive. The vegetation deteriorates and it produces a bloom of invertebrates during the spring. And so we found that the shorebirds were using the managed marsh a great deal. So subsequently, I had a master's student also working with Tom Cashmere and Tom Bartlett, who for a number of years have been banding shorebirds in the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge and at Winus Point. And fortunately, they were recording body weights. So what we did was we collected additional banding information and tried to look at mass gain during migration and the duration of that stopover period using recaptures of banded birds very simply. So what we see here during fall migration is if we plot the length of time that individual birds stayed against their fat levels, we see their fat levels increasing. So they're packing on these energy stores that sustain them during their southward migration during the fall. And we also then looked at the duration of stay, and if we kind of double that, you know, we can see that overall they were staying in that region about 12 days. Some birds lingered, and as they lingered, they lost body weight. We don't exactly know what that is. If they're just birds that weren't migrating, they're not really packing on any more weight and probably losing it. They may be unhealthy birds or maybe birds that aren't going to breed or something like that. I don't really know. But if we look at the individual species, we just see this very almost exponential, slow exponential growth in body weights during that that average stopover duration, which is about 12 to 13 days. And then the few that stay after that really aren't gaining much more body weight. So it's like they get to a maximum body weight that if they get too fat, they're not going to fly as well further south. So they're packing it on fairly quickly. The last, at least Sandpiper, packed it on pretty quick. And most of them, I think when they get to a certain body weight or fat level, then they start migration again. Those that kind of stay and linger a little bit longer are actually losing body weight. Pectoral sandpipers, we don't have as much data, but we saw the same body weight gain in them, as well as the short-billed dowitchers, which is the predominant dowitcher that actually comes through the Lake Erie Marsh region. So you can see during fall migration, they're putting on pretty good fat reserves there. They're staying anywhere from 12 to 16 days to do that. And so when we put all this together, there are habitat associations, what the vegetation conditions are like, and what the water levels are like at different years. We start to ask the question, well, if migration habitat is limiting shorebirds, is it more important to focus on spring or on autumn? I would say the jury is still kind of out. Generally, it's thought that spring migration is more important because those are the breeding birds that are going north. But I'm not so sure about that. I still think it might be autumn migration because it's much more prolonged. It's probably important to the survival of those birds during fall migration. It just seems like the birds during spring migration, we didn't have as much body weight data to work with because we didn't get many recaptures because they're just basically flying through during spring migration. It's like they're more time limited than they are energy limited. But I would say that I'm not comfortable making a statement that we should just focus on autumn. We obviously need to focus on both time periods, but where do we manage for habitat conditions? My bet would still be with the autumn period here. So anyway, just to sum this up, what we've kind of learned is that, you know, these managed marshes are really the mainstay source of habitat for shorebirds. But, you know, some other habitat types like estuaries and cropland do play a role. But I think the anchor habitat is those managed marshes. And I think, and we captured most of our birds in managed marshes, and we showed some pretty good weight gains. And so we've really documented that this Lake Erie marsh region is important as a staging area and for refueling of birds, especially during autumn migration, but to some degree it occurs during spring migration too. And again, the Lake Erie marsh and marsh region probably is worthy of international importance as a wizard site. So with that, I'll stop and just acknowledge the different agencies that have either funded or we've worked with on this shorebird research over the years. And with that, you want me to stop sharing, Marnie?
Sure, why don't you?
Or should I leave it up if somebody wants to look at a graph? I don't know how
yeah, that may not be a bad idea, just to leave it up.
Okay.
Wow, thanks, Bob. That was great. It was like a little trip down memory lane for me. I don't think I've listened to you specifically talk about shorebirds for some time. So I was following along in my bird ID book, and I found some highlighted ones from when I took the class with you a long time ago. So really great information. So thank you so much for sharing that. We've had a few questions about how you can access this presentation. We did record it and we will post it. Hopefully I'll get it posted today. If not, it'll be up on our website by Wednesday. So if you go to woodlandstewards.osu.edu, click on the resources tab, we have a separate section for all of our webinars. And then Bob, we've had a few questions on certain graphics that you shared and interest in having those. So I'll talk to you later about possibly sharing your slide set or some of those graphics. And so hopefully we can post some of those graphics with the webinar. But we do have a few questions. So one of the first ones that came in was in relation to the bills on our different shorebirds. So what is the advantage of a downturned versus an upturned bill?
Well, that's a great question. And man, you started off with maybe one that stumps me a little bit, but I'll give it a shot. Obviously, it's got to do with how they access food. And so I think one of those graphs, let's see here, kind of showed some of these burrows of invertebrates down in the mud here. Let me just find that. Almost there. You know, in this case, you know, they're kind of curved like that. I don't know if that helps them as far as that goes. That's a great question. I don't know what else to say for that. Now, I think part of it too is there's other birds that sort of glean through the water surface, and they, have kind of curved bills and that sort of thing. So it may also help in terms of just kind of sieving through the water surface. But I don't know, I'm guessing that maybe the curved bills are probably a little more flexible as opposed to the straight bills where they're just going straight down and probing into the bottom. And then also it occurs to me that the curved bills are always longer. It seems like even the longer, but shorter, the straight bills are always kind of shorter than these really big long ones like the Whimbrel and that sort of thing. That's my guess at it.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. I'll just throw something in really quick that came to my mind when I was looking at all the pictures you were sharing of the songbird or the shorebirds in hand. What's their temperament? I mean, that kind of a bird in hand, I'd be a little bit nervous with some of their bills.
Yeah, well, yeah, shorebirds are kind of nervous, and that's something we had to kind of take great care with when we were after we caught these birds in mist nets, and we'd get them out as quickly as possible and get them back to the banding station. But sometimes we'd wait a few minutes to get more birds because, you know, you don't want to just grab the first bird and then miss the next 9, right? And so you put them in bags. And I think once they're in the bag, they kind of settle down for a little bit, but they're still kind of nervous and flighty. You know, some of these birds seem rather frail, but they're just small and they're not frail necessarily. But yeah, you know, when we weighed them, we put them up head down into Dixie cups and set them on a scale. And that sort of settles them down. It's like putting on a sock over them. I've never dealt with any of the really large shorebirds. That would be really cool because, you know, they got a bill that can probably inflict a little pain on you.
Yeah, yeah.
They're probably a bit more challenging.
Great. So Robert just chimed in and he said, thanks so much for the presentation. Upturned bills could be better for swishing through the water to locate food. So yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. Kathleen says, wonderful presentation. Isn't it the woodcock that has the descending whinny sound in mating flight displays?
They make a sound. I think about that more as the Wilson snipe has what we call the winnowing sound. Mostly what you hear woodcock doing is painting, and they do that from the ground before or after their flight. But now that I think about it, I think there is sort of a subtle sound that the woodcock produce. They do a similar type of descending flight, but it's the Wilson snipe that's really known for the winnowing. And I think of my time that I spent on the Hudson Bay coast in the spring when I was studying Canada geese, and you go out at night and you hear the snipe were all over the place and they were winnowing, and it's this sort of eerie sound that really just kind of evokes the wilderness setting that was. And so that's something that's really distinct. It's if the woodcock produces a sound, it's not quite as distinct as the Wilson's.
Great. There's a question on what book was the plumage changes slide from?
Oh, you know, I don't know because that's just something I pulled off the internet. It said Eastern Birds. I thought about it. There is probably the Kaufman guides are really good. And I like the Sibley's guide. And so most of your good field guides, like the Petersons and that sort of thing, will have those types of pictures or plates in that sort of thing. There is another book that I don't actually have. I've seen, and I think it's something like Field Guide to Shorebird Identification. If you really want to get into shorebirds, get one that is just shorebirds. There's 2 or 3 that are out there. I would say just Google on Shorebird Field Guide and you will find similar types of plates.
Great. And then Patricia is asking, has the Lake Ontario rising 2.5 feet caused shorebird issues for us?
Oh, in Lake Ontario as opposed to Lake Erie.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know that's a bit of a concern. I don't necessarily, I would surmise not necessarily so. Lake Erie is kind of special, that western basin, because it's so shallow. And so then the shoreline is much more broad and not just very sharp. And that's what Lake Ontario is. I've only seen Lake Ontario once or twice, but my impression is that you've got more of a hard, rocky shoreline. So I mean, I am certain there are shorebirds that stop through there, but whether that would have pushed a lot of birds our way, I kind of doubt it, because I don't think Lake Ontario, with possibly a couple of exceptions, would have major shorebird concentration areas, at least large enough that if the water levels went up, it would push birds our way. So as we get to the eastern basin, and even the central basin of Lake Erie, we don't see near as much shorebird habitat. That western Lake Erie basin is really special in that way because it's so shallow.
Great. What effect do wind turbines have on shorebirds?
Well, I'm not as familiar with that. I know people are looking at that, and that's certainly a concern. Black Swamp Bird Observatory has been heavily involved with doing that. I think their focus has been largely on, forest bird or passerine migrants, neotropical migrants, and that sort of thing. I honestly haven't looked into that to see how vulnerable shorebirds are to that, but that would certainly be, let's see, if you think about, the big wind farms in agricultural areas, that would affect something like American golden plovers, because they really do use that agricultural habitat during the spring when it's flooded and that sort of thing. As far as some of those other interior areas, I'm guessing the shorebirds are mostly passing over many of those large wind farms. They would probably only stop if there were wetlands in association with that. Now that I think about it, I know people have looked at this in the Great Plains region with respect to waterfowl, and I guess they probably have done it with shorebirds as well. But I think you would not want a lot of good-looking shorebird habitat next to those wind farms. I would not do that. Now, the offshore wind farms that are proposed for Lake Erie, that's a potential concern.
Great. All right, I think that is all the questions. If I missed one, do please pop it into the Q&A box. You can also use the chat box at this point in time. So Bob, thank you very, very much. Again, like I said, we'll get this recording posted right away. So just everybody help me in thanking Bob. We do have SAF credits available for this talk. So I am going to, again, thanks Bob, and stop the recording so Kathy can share the link for that. And Bob, if you want to stop sharing at this point, I think Kathy's going to put up a slide.
Yep.
So thanks again.
Yeah, so the link to the survey, if you need to apply